Harold Bloom called his 1998 book about Shakespeare in the subtitle The Invention of the Human. And indeed, humanism, about which we have heard a little bit in a previous video, means also that man becomes interesting in and to himself, and not merely in relation to God. That man becomes interested in man, and this is what Bloom means by the invention of the human, this growing interest in ourselves. Now, we have to keep in mind that this isn't yet the radical subjectivity that we will meet in Romanticism. So some 200 years later. It is not the I of an absolute individual, but rather what we find here are investigations into possible constructions of identity or of subjectivities, possible constructions. So thinking about what can I be, what can I become? And that is already a very revolutionary break with medieval ideas of identity as ordained by God. So the medieval idea is that God gives you your identity, gives you your place in society, and your job is basically to accept that. We can also remember what we said about education, that the idea of medieval as education is that you become educated into the role that you already have, versus the humanist idea that education is actually enables you to move to a different place in society. So in a way, these different concepts, we could compare them to the difference between Eastern and Western role-playing games, computer games, where in the Eastern games, you're usually supposed to grow into a destiny that you have already always been ordained for. And in the Western games, you often get a blank slate character that is then tasked with developing in whatever direction they want. So these are different concepts of whether you need to become that which you were meant to be, or whether it's more or less up to you what you want to become. Excuse me. Stephen Greenblatt called his 1980 book about early modern literature Renaissance Self-Fashioning. This book subtitles From Moore to Shakespeare, so we see this is sort of the frame that we have covered, and we also can see how the ambassadors make another appearance here on the title. According to Greenblatt, the 16th century witnessed an increased self-consciousness about the fashioning of human identity. Men, and occasionally women, learned to manipulate or to fashion their identities according to their circumstances. For Greenblatt, the literature of the great writers of the 16th century, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, produced fictional characters like Faustus or Hamlet, who began self-consciously to reflect on and to manipulate their own identities. Now, this is obviously going to be central stage literally on the drama, where we have many different characters that represent different aspects of identity and where characters assume identities and play with these roles. Lyrical poetry, which is the subject of this lecture, especially of the Petrarchan kind, which is the predominant mode of early modern poetry, seems to imply the identity of the speaker I and of the author. It seems to suggest that whoever is speaking is actually also the person who writes these. And the speaker is indeed closer to individual subjectivity, but it would be wrong to assume an absolute identity of these. The speaker is still assuming identities. He's assuming conventionalized roles, as we will see. Most texts still construct dramatic situation in which an I speaks to a concrete subject that either does or should listen. And we're going to take a look at these lyrical modes and how they do that, what kind of identity they create. And the main identity that we can find in lyrical poetry of the early modern times is indeed the lover. And this, of course, is all based on the influence of one writer, an Italian writer, Francesco Petrarca. As you see, this is already quite a substantial amount of years before our period. Petrarca living from 1304 to 1375, but he at this time became, with his writing, the dominating influence on poetry. Now, Petrarca wrote this series of poems called Il Canzoniere, and you again can see from looking at the dates, this was written between 1327 and 74, that this is a long time project. This is basically a lifelong project of writing these poems. In fact, it's a series of 366 poems, 317 of which are sonnets, so it's almost exclusively sonnets, and the sonnet form will also be the main form of poetical writing in England. So written over the course of 40 years, its central theme is the poet's love for Laura. And Laura is the loved person. It's a love at first sight, but it's a love at first sight situation, but it's also actually a love at only sight situation, because Laura, at the time of their meeting, when Petrarca falls in love with her, is already married, and there is a good likelihood that Laura and Petrarca actually never speak to each other in real life. So that's already one strange aspect, but also very important aspect of this this lyrical setup, that it's a lover addressing a loved person that is unattainable. And she is sort of socially unattainable at the time because she's already married. That becomes even more pronounced after her death, because Petrarca continues to write poems to her. So after her death, there's an even stronger emphasis on this unattainability, when what Petrarca does is he religiously sublimates his love, so it becomes an emblem of a religious devotion. Laura is really just a motivator here. So we know that there are biographical backgrounds to this. We know that there are actual real persons, but we can also see that what Petrarca does goes far beyond these biographical data, and that he creates personas both for himself and for Laura that go beyond these physical persons, which of course is indicated by the name Laura, which isn't the real name of the person. It's a poetical name, but it also is of course a reference to Laurus, to the laurels which crown the head of the victorious poet in these competitions in ancient Greece. So Laura becomes inspiration for the poet and also for the poetry, really. In the 16th century, this poetry is introduced to England by two writers and sort of early adopters of the tradition. The first one is Thomas Wyatt, who basically translates, makes relatively straight translations of Petrarca's poems. Wyatt's professed object was to experiment with the English tongue, to civilize it, to raise its power to those of its neighbors. So by translating this exemplary piece of work from Italian, from this country that had already originated the Renaissance, Wyatt tried to do something similar for England and for English. And through his translations, Wyatt brought notions of Renaissance humanism to England. Another early adopter of Petrarchism in England is Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, an aristocrat, close friend of Wyatt. Both of them are instrumental in introducing the sonnet form and the Petrarchan structure of love poetry into England. Surrey did something to this form, though, in adapting it for English purposes. He changed the form from what we now call the Italian sonnet form to what we now call the English version, where instead of 2 quatrains and 2 tercets, we now have 3 quatrains and a couplet. I'm going to go into more details later on. The point is that Surrey's version needs less rhyme words, and it's the basic fact is just that it's easier in Italian to find syllables that rhyme with each other than it is in English. So it's more of an effort to create the amount of rhymes that are needed for the Italian form, and the English form just makes it a little bit easier. But this form, this change in form, will also bring about a change in structures. Surrey again is another indication of the danger of living at Henry VIII's court. He was in fact beheaded by Henry, or on the orders of Henry as well. But when we talk about the hype of Petrarchan love poetry in early modern English, we really need to talk about Sir Philip Sidney, who is the first author to create a substantial original body of Petrarchan love poetry in English. These are his dates of life. Sidney was a poet, but also a courtier and a soldier. He was actually wounded in battle, and as you can see, he did not live very long. He died from his wound at the tender age of 31, so he might actually have even become a greater poet had he lived a little bit longer. But what he did write is this sequence of Petrarchan love poems called Astrophil and Stella, which he wrote probably between 1581 and 1583 or 5, but which was circulated during his lifetime in manuscript form, but it was not published until after his death in 1591. The sequence contains 108 sonnets and 11 songs in a form that combines actually the classical octave with an English sestet. The sonnets tell of the unsuccessful wooing of Stella, which means star, by Astrophil, which means star lover. The account, again, similar to what we saw in Petrarca, bears some relation to biographical fact, but of course, again, biography only teasingly can be understood to be the foundation of a sonnet sequence, because it is not really a narrative or a biographical genre. It seems to, because these are sequences, so there's development. We can actually see development in from one poem to the next, and that seems to indicate narrative, but they're under no obligation to form a coherent narrative like a novel would need to do, or a biography. So as Stella is not the true addressee of the sonnet, so she's hardly the subject. The love affair provides the context, and the figure of the suffering lover provides the vehicle for an examination rather of those rational and courtly images of human nature that are inscribed by the cultural and by the philosophical discourses of the Renaissance. It is the predicament of Astrophil, whose identity, whose moral and courtly identity is threatened by the passionate and irresistible desires which overwhelm him, which is the true focus. It's again about self-fashioning, about this courtier who is torn in a way by his love. Sidney is also famous for writing one of the first defenses of poetry. It's actually called a defense of poetry, where he argues for the superiority of poetry, and argues that poetry is superior to history precisely because the poet, as he writes, disdaining to be tied to reality, doth grow in effect another nature in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature. So this is the beginning of this debate on whether the poets don't lie, and whether natural sciences shouldn't replace poetry in describing what it actually is. And here is this defense that says, no, we are creating something that could be either ideal or a new version of reality. So we obviously shouldn't understand these poems as straight biographical pronouncements. And we can see this is literature, and this is true for most of the good Petrarchan poetry, that is also literature about literature. And we can maybe see this by looking at the first sonnet from the sequence. Loving in truth, and fain in verse my love to show, that the dear she might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. So he's basically trying to copy, to steal from other writers in order to make persuasive argument to his lover. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled, step-dame studies blows, at others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. So he tries to copy, but invention, originality, creativity flees by being sort of subjected to these other authors. Thus, great with child to speak. So I'm pregnant with these ideas, but I can't get them out, and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. So the muse admonishes him to not look into other people's works, but rather to look in his heart and write what is his true emotions. And that will be, of course, that's the moment when you can start writing, which sounds like a rather sort of romantic topos to dispense with learning and knowledge by rote, and rather to look for original inspiration. The snag here is that this is, by the time that Sidney writes this idea of looking in your heart instead of looking at the works of others has already in itself become a convention. So he chides himself for being conventional by using a convention. So that's a very nice twist here in this poem as well. But when it comes to twisting the form of the Petrarchan sonnet, certainly no other author has come as close to perfection as has Shakespeare, though he is, in chronological terms, one of the last in lines to adopt the Petrarchan form. Shakespeare is now considered as the greatest of the early modern sonnet writers, and that has a lot to do with his modifications to the structure as well. Shakespeare's sonnets were published originally in 1609, and the sequence consists of 154 sonnets, in which he employs the by then conventional English sonnet form, 3 quatrains that are capped by a couplet, so 3 times 4 lines and then 2 lines that are rhymed with themselves. When we look at the full sequence of poems, we can also see that there's a thematic structure emerging, in that they're conventionally divided between the so-called young man sonnets 1 to 126, sonnets that are all addressed to a young man, and then the dark lady sonnets 127 to 152 that are addressed to a woman, that is commonly referred to as the Dark Lady. And even within these, the first series, there are thematical unities, units like the procreation sonnets. The first 17 sonnets actually urge the young man to preserve his beauty and by procreating, by getting a son or a daughter, in order to continue his ephemeral beauty, whereas later poems then start to immortalize the young man through poetry itself. And there's also a series, for example, of poems that address a rival poet. So we can see that there are actually not only the speaker, but there are other characters. There's the young man, there's the dark lady, the rival poet, and all of that seems to imply narrativity again. But one thing we need to be aware of is that when Shakespeare's sonnets first appeared in print in 1609 in a quarto published by Thomas Thorpe, we don't know whether Shakespeare actually authorized the publication by Thorpe, whether he was involved in that, and whether he really authorized the sequence of sonnets. So we usually read them in the sequence, and we order them and we number them in the sequence, but we don't know whether that is Shakespeare's original intention. So it's a little bit difficult to create a consistent narrative that will tell us anything about Shakespeare's biography out of this sequence. So there isn't really no critical consensus on the issue of whether Shakespeare's sonnets, like those of most of his predecessors and contemporaries, constitute a formal sequence and whether they actually develop a narrative. Part of the appeal of Shakespeare's sonnets are in the suggestion, of course, that here the poet is speaking as an autobiographical subject. As you might know, we know very, very little about Shakespeare's life. That has something to do with the fact that he comes from a relatively obscure background in contrast to people like Wyatt or Surrey or Spenser. He wasn't an aristocrat, so his life is relatively obscure. And writers have always searched the sonnet sequence for clues about Shakespeare. Wordsworth actually wrote that with this key, meaning the sonnets, Shakespeare unlocked his heart, although a little bit later Robert Browning answered, if so, the less Shakespeare he. I mean, it would actually be less interesting if that all those poems were merely expressions of biographical situations. So there are, of course, reasons for our willingness to read biography into these poems. One of these reasons is the enigmatic dedication to Mr. W.H., the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets. Scholars have tried everything to find out who W.H. Actually is. And then, of course, as I said, we have a lyrical eye that speaks to characters that we can recognize and that return, like the fair youth and the dark lady and the rival poet. So it seems to imply the development of a story. But if the sonnets do relate a story, I think it's best to see it as a fictional one, not a representation of Shakespeare's own life, and that the speaker poet should not be equated with the author. If you're interested in that, this type of biographical reading, here's a viewing suggestion. There is a movie called A Waste of Shame, which in itself is a title of one of the sonnets, and that tries to create episodes of Shakespeare's life that explain the things that are going on in the sonnets. So if you're reading the sonnets, and you should read as many of the sonnets as possible, you could sort of watch that alongside and speculate about the background to these texts. But of course, we don't read Shakespeare's sonnet primarily for their biographical content, but for their literary significance. Shakespeare's sonnets are variously described as puzzling, enigmatic, even intractable, and critics and readers marvel over their complexity, their wordplay, their density of thought, the depth and the immediacy of emotion, and the exploration of the experience of love. Though he is late to the development, no other author manages to play so successfully with the conventions of the Petrarchan tradition. This is also something that we can see develop in the course of the sequence, that start out relatively formalized and relatively conventional, but then develop further and also make this development where it becomes more and more about the lyrical eye and the writing of the poet. We can, for example, look at one of the earliest poems amongst the procreation sonnets, where this is pretty straightforward. He describes the young man and says, when you're old, your beauty will fade. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed, of small worth held. Then, being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, how much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse, proving his beauty by succession thine. So yeah, I mean, if you can point to a child and says, this will continue my beauty, that's the way. And there's a number of sonnets that go in this vein. But just compare this to a later sonnet that still addresses the same young man. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So it starts out by asking whether the poet should employ a conventional metaphor, comparing the young man to a summer's day, but then rejects us. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And this is the first part where he rejects these conventional ideas. But then look at this, when he finds sort of a new solution to the immortalization of the young man. And he writes, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. That's one of the reasons why the summer's day isn't a good comparison, because the summer's day is over, of course, after a short while. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. And these eternal lines are, of course, the lines of the poem, and the poem itself becomes the monument and becomes the stay of time, where the beauty of the young man can live on forever, as the last lines say, so long as man can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And this is, of course, the poem. So we see how this becomes a self-reflective consideration of the immortality of art, after all. And then of course there's the most famous undercutting of the Petrarchan form, subversion of the Petrarchan form in the sonnet number 130. This is one of the sonnets that is addressed to the dark lady, and that rejects all of the by now stereotypical cliches of comparison by saying, well, my mistress is different. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, so you can't compare them to the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. So that's not quite as drastic as it sounds to us now, because wires, of course, weren't used in the way that we use them now. Wires is really something that comes from making jewelry, so it's very delicate and fine. But they're not. They're black. She's not fair. She's not blonde as all of the other Petrarchan mistresses were. I have seen roses damask, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, so she doesn't float above the ground. It's another image that she's so that the Petrarchan mistress is so ephemeral or so ethereal that she actually glides above the ground. So all of these seem to be that seems to be sort of a very nasty way to talk about your lover, in rejecting all of these and sort of degrading her seemingly. But what he's really rejecting is are the images, and they're worn out and they don't fit. And he doesn't want to just take this catalog of images and apply that to a person, and force the person into these images, as we can see from the last lines. And this is what happens in the Shakespearean sonnet. In the English sonnet, that the last two lines usually turn the meaning around or make some kind of surprise turn. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So I love her as much as any of those women who has been belied by false compare, by these other poets, who have merely who have not looked at the person and described the person as it is, but rather taken the images before looking at reality. So we see the rejection of the tradition by using the tradition, making a very surprising offering of love in this poem. So it's a really a very interesting, fascinating, and a beautiful love poem.